Welcome to my presentation, Baca Behind Bars, Latino Literature from the Prison System. By way of personal introduction, my name is Paul Andrew Guajardo, and I'm currently a senior at Brigham Young University. I am studying English literature and history and minoring in Latin American studies. I was able to read A Place to Stand by Jimmy Santiago Baca over the summer, and I was intrigued by the critique of the prison system and the culture that it offered. And I'm very excited to give you guys a little bit more background information on that specific work and how it ties into the overall theme of prisons and prison literature. Thank you so much for listening. An excellent question to start off with is, who is Jimmy Santiago Baca? Well, Jimmy Santiago Baca is a writer, essayist, and poet from New Mexico. He was born in 1952, and along with being an award-winning writer, he also spent 6.5 years in prison. So when he was 21, he was convicted, and he spent 3 of those 6 years in isolation. But there he tells a story in A Place to Stand about how he learned to read and write and how he expressed himself through writing. So not only is this book interesting from the point of view of a memoir, but it's also interesting to see what it says about the prison system in general, and it gives us a specific view into prison life. We won't go over all of these, but he has won many awards, including the Pushcart Prize, and he's held multiple endowed chairs at Yale University, one at Colorado College, at UC Berkeley, and so he is definitely an important writer in this movement. In addition to A Place to Stand, which is the book we'll be looking at today, Baca has written many other collections of poetry, novels, plays, and even collections of essays. Here are some more examples, and if you are interested, you're more than welcome to check out the other books as well. A practical question that I would like to answer for you all is, why should you listen to this presentation, and why does any of this matter? So the problem is that we will be looking at is the increasing incarceration rates among the Latino group. Hispanics or Latinos are the largest minority population in the United States. And what we have the opportunity to do is to take the story, A Place to Stand, Baca's work, and use that as a lens to understand and interpret other prison experiences, and not only have a critical reading of maybe Baca's personal growth and change, but also some of the reasons for the policies that are in place, and then also a critical view of which policies were helpful and which policies might need to be changed. This is not a definitive presentation, but it can open the door for a further conversation. As was mentioned, the Hispanic or Latino group is the largest minority group in the United States, according to the 2019 Census Bureau. About 18.4% of the United States identifies as Hispanic or Latino, whereas only around 13.8 are Black or African American, and then the next largest is around 5.9, which is the Asian or Asian American minority group. And so this just also emphasizes the point at how important it is to look at the Latino literature and prison experience. Another problem that needs addressing is that while the Hispanic or Latino population is around 18% of the overall United States population, they're overrepresented in the prison system, and around 30%, or almost 1 in 3 inmates in the United States is Hispanic or Latino, which is disproportionate. So now we can talk about the specific work, A Place to Stand, which was published in 2001 by Baca, and it's told as his memoir. It's a personal story. It's a story of redemption, and it's a story of how he entered the prison system and then learned how to read and write, and kind of opened his worldview and learned the power of language. So it's a powerful story, but that's not going to keep us from looking at some of the harder parts of it and taking a critical view of it as well. In the opening few pages of the work, Baca says, "I have never told the full story of my transformation, a story I now believe is important, especially for my sons playing in their room. I want them to know my heart and not be confused by conflicting rumors and gossip, wondering which ones are true." So here, Baca posits that the main purpose of the work is to educate his children, to give them a little bit more background on his life, and when people say, oh, your father was a convict, they'll know the full story. We also need to keep this in mind that Baca is probably going to be writing through a lens and going to emphasize the best parts if he's going to tell this story for his family. And while he does mention some of the ups and downs, it will be colored through that, wanting to help his sons maybe understand him as the good guy. And so we need to be aware of that. As readers, we kind of know the end from the beginning, and so we know that Baca will end up in prison. And so in the first few pages, he also mentions this fact and says, quote, "I landed there as I had landed in the others, by being a poor kid with too much anger and the wrong skin color." So here, Baca suggests that the reason why he went to prison is because he, grew up poor, had anger issues. He doesn't give the root for those, but we see that a rather dysfunctional family could have been one of the causes, and then the wrong skin color, so perhaps implicit racism as well. So these are the reasons why, according to him, he ended up in prison. While in prison, he meets other characters, and they take similar stances. One of them says, quote, "Snitches are no good," Brujo said. "We were in prison because of them. We've lost our families, our lives, our freedom because of them. They have caused us much pain." And here, if we take a critical look, we'll start to notice that the blame is being shifted subtly to the people who ousted the people in the prison, the inmates, instead of the actual actions that led there. So it's not necessarily the judge, it's not the person themselves, it's the tattletales. And if we think about this for a second, we might question the implicit premise. As we know that the primary audience of the book are Baca's children, when we read some of his reasoning, we might consider this lens as well. And so he says, "I'd sold drugs only to get back to Albuquerque, to be with someone I loved, to be respected, to be part of a community. I didn't want to be like Galvin or these lawyers earning money by screwing people." And so here, again, he paints himself as the good guy, as only selling drugs to as the means to an end. And that end is something that we all want. Everybody wants to be loved and respected. We all want to be part of a community. And so here he paints the lawyers and the judges in later chapters as the people who are actually causing harm, and the drug dealers are just the people who are trying to be accepted by society. Now, this premise might have some clout for some of you and maybe not for others, but it's important to keep these kind of implicit readings in the back of our mind, knowing that one, this is a memoir, and two, so he's going to kind of paint himself as the hero of the story, and two, that he wants it to be convincing for his children. So there might be a counter argument if we look for it, and we should consider that as well. Part of the counter argument Baca actually gives himself. So in some passages he will be very remorseful and say that he only sold drugs to kind of get himself back on his feet, and that he didn't want the lifestyle, it was the only option. And in other passages he suggests that everything else bored him and that he didn't want to go the slow route of making money. So there are some implicit contradictions in his narrative, but here's just a few. So I wanted to buy grandma a new stove and a new phone. That seems pretty reasonable. But a little bit later on in the quote, I'd buy my brother a new truck and my sister a new car once we got home. I'd like to put my dad in the hospital to get him to stop drinking and then to buy him his own house and his car. So at first it was just a small means to kind of help himself, and then he's taking it, and as he grows his business and as he starts selling more and more, his goals get bigger and bigger, and so he's not exactly comfortable with stopping and cutting his losses. So even though he says it wasn't like we were going to be big dealers or anything, as the story progresses, he definitely does become a bigger dealer. And then at the end it says, our clients were generally depressed and down on their luck and needing something to lift their spirits. So again, he's kind of painting himself as the hero, someone who is coming to the masses to help them, and it's the other people who are kind of holding them back. It's the judges, it's the corrupt policemen, and things like that. Again, some of these ideas might have sway with some of the audience, and some of them might be a little bit less persuasive, but these are examples that Baca gives. Obviously, we won't have time to go over all of the nuances of the plot and of the story. It is a very gripping tale, and I would recommend reading it. But as we get to the end of the narrative, Baca serves his 6.5 years. He learns to read and write. He feels like a new man coming out. He's learning the power of language and of poetry. And when he gets out, he actually goes to a Catholic church. He hasn't been to Mass in years. And he sees a young family. It's the baptism of their young son. And so this is what he says of the father of the family in a very moving quote. So he says, he looked just like my father, and she looked just like my mother, a brown baby that looked just like me. And then he walks out of the cathedral and it starts to rain, and he feels like he himself is getting baptized. So it's a very moving story. But we're going to focus a little bit more on the prison aspects. And so whether he deserved it or not, that's an entirely different question. Obviously, the book was written to take a positive stance and kind of paint him as the hero, but we will look at some of the problems with the prison system next. I would now like to share a story from Baca's A Place to Stand. It's on page 113, and in this story, one of Baca's acquaintances in prison faces the dilemma of allying himself with a gang or a criminal organization, or being the target of violence. And this is a common occurrence in the prisons, and one which begs the question, when you do cluster a large amount of inmates, some very violent, you're obviously going to have repercussions for doing that. Fights and tussles are going to break out. And so the question is, how can you protect the prisoners who are already in prison, right? A question could be asked, is it a violation of human rights to leave the prisoners unprotected from each other? Obviously, the prison guards protect themselves and make sure that everybody stays in line, but usually they turn a blind eye to inmate-on-inmate violence. So as we listen to the story, we might think about what are some possible solutions. It begins, "There la M, Mexican Mafia." I whistled to get his attention, but only the bangers turned to look at me. "Do that again," Maricon warned, "and it'll get you killed." "I can't warn him?" I asked, feeling some allegiance because we had arrived together. "Do your time, not his. He stands the line or punks out." They strutted, towels in hand, boxer shorts and thongs. Down the tier, Guido was lying down, feet to the bars, towards the tier. They stopped in front of his cell. One of them slipped a toothbrush from his towel and ran the bristles up the pads of Guido's bare feet. Then they walked away, stuffing the toothbrush back into a rolled towel. Blood gushed from Guido's feet. He got up, wedged his face between the bars, and yelled, "I'll show you how it's done, punks." Grinning, he said, "Ain't nothing but a meatball," and sat down, tore his sheet in strips, and wrapped his feet. "They had a razor blade in the brush," Maricon said. "Why?" "Trying to get him to pay protection. It happens to fish, first-timers." And so in this story we can see that the problem of the prisoners is only exacerbated by their own company, and left relatively unguarded, which brings up this question, how can we protect or help the prisoners have, at least if not an enjoyable experience in the prisons, a safe one where they don't have to ally themselves with a gang or a criminal organization to receive protection. So is it just that prisoners have to pay protection or get beat up and possibly fatally wounded just because there isn't oversight? A little bit later on in the narrative, Baca tells another story of prison violence, but this time it has to do with himself and some would-be attackers. This following scene is found on page 129 of A Place to Stand. Quote, "Ojo, águila," Chaco warned. "Watch out." As he said it, I saw them draw shanks and move quickly towards me. Simultaneously, I leaped up and grabbed the butcher knife the chef was chopping onions with. I was behind the table, and one of them jumped over it. Unable to stop his forward momentum, he came on me from above, and I slit his stomach. He clutched his intestines as they slopped out of his gut and fell on the chopping block, his blood all over the vegetables. The other one stopped dead in his tracks and dashed out. The chef slammed the button, and the alarm went off. It was quick, pure instinct and survival. I wiped the knife handle on my white apron and dropped it and walked out the back door. So here we can see that Baca paints himself as a would-be victim, even though he is the one who does most of the damage. And again, some questions we can ask is, in these situations, how do we know which prisoner is actually taking advantage of the other prisoners, which one is the victim, which one is the aggressor, and can prisoners be trusted with certain jobs if they harm others? Should they be allowed in the kitchen with knives and things like that if they can turn and use them on their fellow inmates? Essentially, even though the alarm was sounded, the damage was already done, and we have to ask ourselves if the prisons are really helping these prisoners or just giving a playground, essentially, for these atrocities to happen. In conclusion, what we want to emphasize is the redemptive or the corrective power of the prisons. Obviously, we don't want people to just enter the prisons and serve time and come out worse than they were because they had to get involved with gangs just to protect themselves or things like that. One of the most powerful parts of Baca's story is that even if we might have mixed feelings for the reason why he was in prison, he definitely learned and kind of changed himself through literature, through reading, through his poetry, and that really comes out and helped him after the prison as well. So for Baca, it could become a transformative experience as well, one that kind of elevated his spirit and allowed him to do something after the prison. The other problem is just while we need to protect, obviously, the prisoners, and prisoner inmate on inmate violence that was so rampant in the story is just atrocious, essentially. And so instead of just taking a prison experience as a punishment, I think that if we focus and if we look for more opportunities to help the inmates kind of broaden their horizons and do what Baca did, kind of express himself and his feelings through the written word, we might have more success overall. So in conclusion, I think these narratives are very important to read and to study because they'll help us ask the questions: how can we help improve the prison system? How can we help the prisoners and maybe not just the institution? How can we help get these people back on their feet and living productive and fulfilling lives like Baca was able to go on to do? And how can this maybe help us develop more empathy and understand the prison system ourselves? There's a lot that can be done on this topic. Obviously, we're just brushing it, and I'm excited to read further research on this topic. But thank you guys so much for listening, and I really appreciate the company. Finally, throughout this presentation, I referenced A Place to Stand by Jimmy Santiago Baca, and if you would like to pick up your own copy, you can do so from Grove Press, and thank you guys so much.